Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be talking about three books. They are all they were all written by Brian Bagnall, and they cover the history of Commodore computers. The first one is On the Edge, the second is the Amiga Years, and then the last one is, thankfully, named The Final Years. I learned an awful lot about Commodore from these books. I do have some issues, though, so let's get into the first one. So On the Edge is the first one, and the book is mainly going to focus on the history of Commodore from 1977 to 1984. And here's the weird part about these books. They all cover Commodore to like the end of its lifespan. So once the company kind of dissolved, that's when each book ends. But they tend to kind of target in on specific spots. So On the Edge focuses more on like the Jack Tramiel era. The Amiga Years is going to focus more on the Amiga, but really when Commodore bought the Amiga. And then the Final Years is going to cover when they're closing. It's one of the things that kind of annoys me a little bit about these books, and I just kind of wanted to get it out of the way quickly with On the Edge because I don't want to have to keep bringing it up. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, there are a lot of quotes in this book from the engineers that worked at Commodore, and it kind of shows how much information was really gained by Brian while he was making all of this, and he puts it together in a really easy to read format. So the book talks an awful lot about Chuck Peddle and some of the other engineers that Chuck hired along the way. These were really the first people that sort of built Commodore's computer industry. I think that computer business, sorry. Maybe industry. Let's stick with business for right now. They kind of built the first, they were working on the first projects. They're the ones that built the PET, and they were sort of laying out the vision for what Commodore should have been if they didn't have a self-sabotage fetish, which I'll get into later. So we go over a lot of the different projects that Chuck was sort of trying to get off of the ground. And we hear about a lot of the people that he hired and sort of his hiring philosophy and the way he was trying to build Commodore for the future. And we also hear a lot about Jack Tramiel. He was the founder of Commodore, and he had a very interesting management style. I don't think I would have wanted to have worked with him, but he definitely got the job done, if that makes any sense. We also hear quite a bit about the financial situation and how Jack wasn't in control of the money because at this point he wasn't a majority shareholder. He had investors that had come in to kind of prop them up when the calculator business sort of fell through. And you also hear a lot about vertical integration. So Jack wanted his company to basically be able to do everything from manufacturing the simple things to, production to selling. He wanted them to be able to do everything. And it's a good way to do it, and it sort of worked. Like, they had a bunch of workarounds and everything that they could do, so if they had a piece of equipment that was maybe too expensive for them to purchase, they could find something that was similar that maybe didn't work as well but could work in order to like finish up their design. They're going to be like very successful in the short term, Commodore is, but it sort of seems to me like there was a lot of short-term planning. Everything was kind of on the whim of what Jack wanted. At least that was my reading of this. So you go into work one day and you have an idea and you work on this idea for like 5 or 6 months, and then you get told, well, Jack had another idea, he listened to somebody else, so your project's canceled, we're going in a completely different direction with this other computer. So there really doesn't seem to have been a lot of long-term planning. But the problem with this is we don't get quotes from Jack Tramiel. So there's kind of a gap in information here. You're only really getting part of the story. It's an important part, but we're missing kind of some other stuff that would have explained some more things. It's kind of like reading every other chapter in a book, is one way that I would put it. You're getting the gist of what was going on, but you're not getting a complete picture of it. It does seem that, Chuck had a plan for the direction that he thought Commodore should be going in for their computers. And he made a bunch of moves to kind of get Commodore like ahead of the competition and point it in the right direction. Unfortunately, he didn't really mesh too well with Jack, and you find that happens a lot during these early years. Jack would do some weird things that didn't quite... They would make sense, but they wouldn't make sense right away. So with the... I don't know if this happened with the PET, but definitely with the VIC-20, the computer that came after the PET, he offered the person who designed it, you can either get your base salary, or I will give you like a certain amount, like a small amount of money for each VIC-20 sold. I think this was done with the PET as well, but I don't have that in my notes. And that's a good deal. In the long term, that's a good deal. But it's almost like a poison pill, where you're not making any money for the duration of the computer being built, like from design to production. So it makes it kind of hard to, live until you get like this windfall of money coming in. So a lot of the engineers didn't seem to take this. And that's... I wouldn't say that kind of screwed them over, but it sort of stopped them from getting more money than what they originally did. I don't know if I would have... I don't know. I can't really put myself in that position to really think about that. It seems like a raw deal, but it could lead to something if you could sort of withstand it. The problem is these guys had families and that sort of thing. You have bills and that stuff. I'm going to move on because I could probably, ramble on about this for much longer than I need to. So there are really two things that I kind of want to wrap this up with before I give like my final thoughts on this book. Or I'll save my final thoughts at the end. There are two things that I want to kind of close this out with, and that is... Commodore never really seemed to capitalize on their success. You can say that they did when, they got at their foot in the door in the computer market with the PET. They followed it up with the VIC-20, but those weren't the same market that they were aiming at. And you didn't really get a successor to the PET, and you sort of got a successor to the VIC-20, but with those computers, they abandoned the software in between. So you make software for the PET that doesn't translate to the VIC-20. You make software for the VIC-20, and that won't translate to the Commodore 64 because none of these computers are compatible with each other. And that sort of hampers like your developers that, want to one, capitalize on sales of their software, and two, want to keep making money off of these things. So there's not really a lot of incentive to release new software for a system that's no longer being supported by the company, and they don't release an improved version of the computer they don't release a new version of the computer, and they're sort of expecting their customer base for the hardware to drop the old computer and move on to this newer one. It's kind of a problem that you'll see cropping up quite a few times with Commodore. The other thing that would come or become an issue for Commodore, and you'll see it over and over again, especially in the early years and a little bit into kind of after they've gotten the Amiga going. They really kind of treated their engineers like crap. I mentioned the poison pill deal, but there were other things that would go on where just none of the success was really attributed to the engineers, and this happened a lot in the early 80s and probably into the mid and the late 80s as well, but definitely in the early 80s. None of these engineers were getting credit. They weren't getting kind of bonuses, so they would be given those poison pill contracts, but after the computer became a success, they wouldn't get like some kind of a bonus afterwards. But Jack and all of his friends would. Yeah, they would definitely get bonuses, but none of the people who did a lot of the work to build the product, they wouldn't get anything. Just the people who were selling the product. And you can kind of argue whether or not that's right, that if you reward one group over the other. Personally, I don't think that's right, but sure, if you want to argue that, then okay. It just seems a little weird to me. So what would happen is, after each of these early computers, you would have a brain drain happen. All the engineers that make the computer wouldn't get any of the rewards that the company is reaping for these things. So those engineers would leave and go find other employment. Some of them would come back, but for the most part, it doesn't seem like they would. This happened with the PET, it happened with the VIC-20, and what really screwed them over is when it happened with the Commodore 64, because from reading this and the other books, it kind of seems like none of that knowledge was retained. It was just kind of lost after each of those computers. So if you wanted to do backwards compatible stuff, which we'll get into with the Amiga years, you kind of had to like reverse engineer almost the old computer in order to try to do backwards compatibility. So kind of closing out this book, they get the Commodore 64 made. That's a huge success. It's much more successful than, the PET and the VIC-20. By the time the Commodore 64 is released, Chuck Peddle and his team are mostly gone. You get a new group of engineers that build a very simple computer that they can sell for cheap, which is kind of what Jack Tramiel always wanted. He wanted low-cost stuff that's easy to sell to people, and you can pick it up anywhere, it's easy to use, that sort of thing. And they did very well. But they never really took advantage of it, and this kind of goes back to the finances that I mentioned earlier, where Jack wasn't in control of the money. Irving Gould was, and he never wanted to give Jack the money to reinvest in the company. And he didn't like the fact that Jack was trying to bring his sons in, and that Jack was getting a lot of the credit for everything. And this would become a problem with Irving Gould. He always wanted credit for what everyone else did, which is a whole different can of worms that I don't really want to get into. But yeah, it's very strange the way they sort of mismanaged seemingly everything. If Jack had a plan for where Commodore should go, that's not in these books, and that's kind of lost to time at this point. So yeah, that's one question that is just going to have to remain answered, or unanswered, sorry. And yeah, that's pretty much everything that I grabbed from On the Edge. It does go to completion. You do get the stories about the Amiga team here. You get the stories about kind of the end of Commodore, but they're not gone in as in depth as some of the earlier years and everything. So let's take a short break, and then we'll go on to book 2 with the Amiga years, and just more rampant stupidity at Commodore.
Some people buy an IBM personal computer to manage their finances. But after spending $1,355, what finances are left to manage? Others think one of those tiny computers will do. Fine for storing a few phone numbers and recipes for Nestle Road pie. There's a choice between spending too much or getting too little computer. The Commodore 64 gives you as much memory as the IBM at less than half the cost.
All right, let's get into the second book. This is on the Amiga Years, and it's really just the years when Commodore was, courting the Amiga team, and also when they were putting out Amiga computers. It talks about some other stuff as well. There's a lot of talk of business computers in this one, and just some other systems that I wasn't totally sure on what they were, but they were essentially business computers. And then they talk about the Commodore 128. They also talk about the Plus 4 and a few other computers. So it doesn't just focus on, Commodore buying the Amiga. It goes into a whole bunch of other craziness. So the time period that this book really focuses in on is 1982 to 1987. So you get a lot of overlap between this and the previous book, and it does kind of feel a little bit like you're rereading some stuff from the first book at times. I like it, but I feel like this could have been a lot shorter. I feel like at this point, Brian probably knew he was writing a trilogy at least, and probably didn't need to sort of include a lot of the stuff that he did in the first book. It feels weird, but let's keep going. I won't get too derailed with that. So we start off with probably the most interesting thing in here, which was the Commodore 128 book, or the 128 story, and it's incredibly interesting. I thought the story of how Commodore got the Amiga chipset. Wow, sorry about that. So how they got the Amiga chipset, I thought that was pretty interesting, but I had heard it a number of times. With the Commodore 128, goddamn, that thing sounded like just a mess of insanity. And it also introduced me to Bill Hurd, so that was kind of fun. I got to read his book. That video is probably coming out before this one, and that book is incredibly interesting. So I'm not going to go too in depth on the Commodore 128 story here, even though I do find it to be just an amazing story of how they built that. The story of the Amiga chipset, though, that one is really cool. Just how they started off on their own. They wanted to build a console at first, and then it slowly evolved into them building a computer. And how they kind of built the different chips for the computer and everything. They built them out into the way I'm understanding it, the way that they built them out into like their own circuit boards and then kind of minimized them down. I might be oversimplifying that, but I think that's the way it was described a few times, or at least that's how I read it. So if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but that's just sort of what I got from reading it. The thing that I really focused on was sort of like the financial situation with the Amiga. So after they get the chipset built, for the most part, it's not completely finished up, and the company's not really financially stable at all. They're sort of just getting by on what they have. They get courted by Atari first. And it's pretty cool the way this whole thing is laid out. So Atari wanted to buy the chipset, And Amiga got into kind of a bidding war with Commodore and Atari. Jack Tramiel had been forced out of Commodore at this point, so he's now the owner of Atari. And it's described in both this book and in the previous one that Jack's kind of a notorious person when it comes to deals. Like, you didn't really want to do a deal with him because he was going to screw you over. And he tries to screw over the Amiga team. He loans them the money to keep going, but they have a short window to pay it back, and if they don't pay it back, then Jack essentially owns the company. There's more to it than that, but that's an oversimplified version of what happened. So Commodore steps in. They offer to purchase Amiga, not just the Amiga chipset, but the entire company, for a ridiculous amount of money back in the 80s. Now it's still a lot of money, but it's not as ridiculous as some of the business deals now. Amiga agrees to it. They pay back Atari, and then they get there. I believe it was like 19 or 20, or no, it was more than that. It was between 20 and 30 million. They get that, which Commodore basically overpays for. They could have just bought the chipset for like a third or less, but they buy the whole company. Atari sues them. There's a whole bunch of legal issues that go on. But what it boils down to is Amiga is now owned by Commodore. At the same time, Commodore is still making the C128 or the Commodore 128, and that's just having a whole bunch of fun with it, and that's just going crazy. And they then decide they're going to release the Amiga, and this is one thing that really hit home for this is at this time Commodore is just wasting money left and right, but they're not spending it where they should be spending it, and they end up just not marketing the Amiga at all for the most part, or they market it late. But let's back up a little bit here and kind of talk about what was going on at Commodore after Jack Tramiel left. So it's covered in the book a little bit. Tramiel gets forced out. They hire a new guy who was the CEO of some steel company that I can't remember off the top of my head, and I stupidly didn't write it down. He gets hired by Irving Gould, and Irving Gould he basically starts focusing more on the company at this point. They hire this steel guy who doesn't understand computers, which, that's not really a big deal, but he also doesn't understand the evolving market that he walked into. So they start throwing money around left and right. They don't invest in things that they should, and they start overpaying for shit that they don't need. For example, they didn't need to buy Amiga at all. They could have just bought the chipset. Instead, they buy the entire company, and they don't do anything with these engineers. They basically treat them like garbage, and the Amiga team essentially leaves. This happens over a course of time. But they start doing other stupid things. They had an LCD screen company that had been purchased by Tramiel, and they try to make an LCD computer. And they get like a prototype made and everything. And it never comes out because, if I'm remembering all this right, I believe it was Marshall Smith, the then CEO of Commodore at the time, talked with the CEO of Radio Shack, and Radio Shack's guy said, "There's no money in the LCD market. You guys should really stop this and get out of it." So, in just a sheer stroke of brilliance, the CEO of Commodore agrees with the CEO of Radio Shack. They cancel their LCD computer, and they just sort of scrap it. Radio Shack then releases their own LCD computer, and I think it did fairly well for them at the time. It's just one of these weird stories with Commodore where you're like, of course, where you look at it and you go, of course they went out of business. This is exactly why they went out of business, because they are incredibly stupid. So, Marshall Smith, he only lasts about a year, maybe a little more than that, as the CEO of Commodore. And he did so much damage to Commodore that he set them into a hole and ended up getting fired. I honestly think Commodore would have lasted longer if Marshall Smith had never been hired. That's just me speculating. I have no proof for that whatsoever, but it kind of feels that way from reading Brian's book. It's really weird. I don't really get it. But now we come to the Thomas Radigan era of Commodore, and he made a lot of attempts to kind of turn things around. Cancels a lot of the projects that just aren't going anywhere, and really just focuses Commodore in on the Commodore 64 line of computers and the Amiga line of computers. So at the time, they were just sort of throwing anything at the wall. It's not always a bad strategy to have a bunch of engineering projects going on at the same time, but they had too many going on that were just ending up in development hell and not going anywhere. That's foreshadowing for what we're going to see in the final years, but that's really what was going on. You just had a whole bunch of projects that weren't going to get finished and were started. There was no oversight. The management was really terrible. It was terrible across the board, but you had bad middle managers that were just sort of getting in the way and trying to justify their existence. You had bad upper management that wasn't paying attention to how bad the middle managers were doing. No one was talking to the workforce for the most part. And no one was really checking to see if projects were getting done. It was just kind of a crap situation all around. And that short span of Marshall Smith really plunged Commodore into just a death spiral. So enter Thomas Radigan, as I mentioned earlier. He does his best to pull them out, and he actually succeeds. He does a lot of the things that he's planning on doing, and he's the first person since Trammell left the company that kind of seems like he has an idea of what they're doing. He sort of has a direction. He steps in, stops a lot of the bleeding, but unfortunately, Radigan has a falling out with Gould and gets forced out of the company by basically Irving Gould, who thought he wasn't getting credit for everything, and because Irving Gould was listening to another guy that we'll get into in the next book. And yeah, it's really weird. From reading this book, it felt like Gould just wanted the spotlight on him. Like, he wanted to be given credit for all the success of the company. The only problem is he had absolutely nothing to do with the success of Commodore, and he played a significant role in all of the company's failures for the most part. So that's kind of wrapping up the Amiga years. It goes on to the end, but that's what the final years is for. That's when we talk about just gross incompetence. If you thought there was a lot of stupidity going on during the Amiga years, then Jesus Christ, there's so much more in the final years. Alright, no break this time. Let's just roll right into the next one. And then we'll take a break when we get to right before my final thoughts. So this is the final years. This one covers the time period from 1987 to 1994. When in 1994, that's when Irving Gould basically liquidated the company. The Commodore trademark continues on to this day, but they were kind of done as a hardware company. And the trademarks and everything, those are just the whole other can of worms and weirdness. Part of me wonders, how the company would have fared if Gould and Radigan had been able to pull their egos or put their egos aside and kind of come together. But that is something that we are never going to know. So in this book, I think Brian does a much better job of expanding on what was said in the first book here. The Amiga Years reused a lot of information and stories from On the Edge. In this one, I felt like there was more information I hadn't read yet. We get into the Fall of Commodore, and that gets explained very well. There are some really interesting stories about the people trying to save the company and, just trying to do whatever they could to keep this, sinking ship afloat. But at the end of the day, you can only move around the deck chairs on the Titanic so many times before you realize I need to get to a lifeboat. While I was reading this, I felt like the blame could be placed on Irving Gould and Mehdi Ali. Mehdi Ali was brought in by Gould, one, to kind of help restructure the company back in the Amiga years, and for some odd reason, he thought Ali was the best person to run this thing. I don't know why, but yeah, it just kind of seems like both of these guys were there to pick at the corpse and get as much as they could out of it before the thing just went under. I have written down here in my wonderful list of notes, which I occasionally pay attention to, it seems like they didn't have any idea of what they were doing or what would be best for the company. I'd like to think that they were both trying their best to fix everything, but they just didn't know what they were doing, and what's even worse is I don't think they wanted to learn how to run the company. I think they believed that they were doing everything right, and it was everyone else who was screwing up. That's just not the case, though. It's looking at what they were doing and the decisions that they made and how they just didn't pay any attention, and the bonuses that they were giving themselves despite the fact that they knew what the books were. It's hard to say that, I don't know, it's really hard to say that they cared about the company in the way that Jack Tramiel did. I'll leave it at that, and we'll move on to some of the weird stories. So the first big thing that's brought up is there was just a void of leadership in the engineering department. People coming up with products that the company needed to sell. The products would get stuck in development cycles, like I mentioned in the previous book, and they just weren't making it into the production stage. This would be one if you're a project management person. This would be them getting stuck in the iteration project, or in the iterating project. They would make an idea and then go into sort of the production cycle or into the development cycle. They'd make their hardware prototype, they'd test it out, find out what bugs were in it, work on fixing those bugs, make another product, and then just keep doing that cycle over and over again, and never make it to the product testing phase and then on to marketing it and selling it. The one that really stuck out to me while I was reading this was the Commodore 65. That one seems to kind of run throughout the entire book, from what I remember, or it feels like that way. At least it runs through most of the time that Commodore was still around, up until we get into like the CD-TV and the Amiga 32. So with the Commodore 65, I think the original version of it was supposed to be the NES killer, or the Nintendo Entertainment System killer. And then it kind of turned into a computer, and then it turned back into the NES killer. And by the time that they were finished with it, or at least got it back on the right path, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis were already out, so there was no point in making an NES killer because it had already been killed, one, by the company that, made the original, by Nintendo, and then it was, further killed off by the Genesis, if you want to really get into it. Basically, 16-bit consoles came around, and there was no reason to kill off the 8-bit consoles because time was going to take care of that. Sorry if that was a bit convoluted, but that was essentially what was going on. You had a bunch of engineers that were just working on this, and the product seemed to come out of nowhere. It was just one guy saying, I'm going to build this, other people getting put on the project that he didn't want on the project, and middle management just not being there. There was just no management to control what was happening. At least it felt that way while I was reading this. I'm sure the people that were involved in it, they were trying their best, trying to do everything they could. But just from reading these accounts that Brian's laid out, it felt like there was just no leadership there. And I really felt, the Commodore 65, that project just best exemplified the problems with Commodore at this time. They just didn't really have a good project management. I'm fairly confident the idea hadn't really come about. We like to make up jobs for people so that they have a reason to exist. And it kind of feels like project management is one of those things. It's one of the things where if you have a good project manager, then everything runs smoothly. You don't really hear too much about them. If you have a bad project manager, everything goes to shit, and you hear about it pretty quick. But yeah, it's one of those weird things. With the Commodore 64, I think there was just an identity crisis with what it actually wanted to be, whether they wanted it to be a computer or a console. You had competing engineering teams that also had that same issue, where some of them are building like parts of it to be a computer, others are building parts of it to be a console. You have feature creep going into it. It's like every terrible thing that could go wrong was going wrong with the Commodore 65. The last two products that are really talked about are the CD-TV and the Amiga CD32. Both of those really went against the business model that was Commodore, but at this point in the final years, I have no idea what their business model was. I guess if I could best say what their business was at this point, it was failing to put out products and, just being awful. They were still making the Amiga computers, so that was good. They still were getting those out, but they made a whole bunch of shit that just didn't fit in, and it didn't really need to exist. These projects also took resources away from other stuff that, probably would have done better than the CD32 and the CD-TV. I'm looking back at this in hindsight, so maybe there's probably a decent chance that I'm wrong on that, but it just feels like if they had stuck with computers, they probably would have been better off than what they were. I don't know. It's a very weird thing that's going on at Commodore at this time. There are a bunch of other weird stories in here just before we close stuff out. Just some wacky stories of the people that work there. You know, like the guy who really wanted speed bumps in the parking lot, and all the engineers that just kind of ignored them, so he kept building bigger and bigger speed bumps. That one was kind of cool the first time I read it. It was less cool the second time I read it. The third time I read it, I was just kind of like, okay, great, we're talking about speed bumps again. Whatever. You hear more about stories about the engineers and kind of the end of everything at the final years. And you hear about how just stuff didn't really end well. They kind of just found out that stuff was closing out. I really think this book is great. The two people that aren't in the book, you don't ever hear from Irving Gould or from Mediali. And from doing a little research to see if they ever responded, which I know I'm duplicating the efforts that Brian made, because he probably would have grabbed quotes from them or something like that, but I wanted to check it out too, just to see. I couldn't find anything from either of them, and it would have been nice to have their side of the story here, but that's just not really present in the book. I don't think it would have changed my mind on this at all. I don't think it really would have impacted the story, because I have a pretty good idea of what they would have said. Most of that would have just been defending themselves and defending their actions. Even though when you read what they were doing in these books, it makes it really hard to believe that they really cared about what was going on at Commodore, and it kind of feels like they were just there to, just pick at the bones of the company and take whatever they could and just get out with as much money as possible. I don't know. I don't really want to leave us on a downer, so let's take a little bit of a break, and then we'll go into my final thoughts on these three books.
It's refreshment time, folks.
Taste that beats the others cold. Pepsi pours it on. Taste that beats the others cold. Pepsi pours it on.
Whew. So this was a long one. Sorry about that. I just kind of wanted to combine all three of these, and I didn't really think it was going to go on this long. I knew it was going to be long, but I'm really sorry about the length of this video. I hope everybody enjoyed it, but I can completely understand if you thought it was too long and you're kind of sick of my stock footage adventures at this point. Anyway, these three books I think are very good, but I don't know if this needed to be three books. I really don't. I thought the first book was really good at setting everything up, and I feel like it did a good job of covering what was going on in the Amiga years. I don't know. I don't feel like the Amiga years really needed to be a standalone book, or if you wanted to do it that way, combine Amiga years with the final years, and then it probably would have been a lot better, because you would have gotten a complete story and told, like, the first half of Commodore stop, and then told the second half where just a whole lot more shit happened. Just looking at the Amiga years itself as a book, it feels like there is a lot of just overlapping information. It's not a filler book, because there's a lot of good stuff in there, but there are a lot of stories that don't need to be told again in that book. At least for me, I don't think they need to be told again. And then when you get into the final years, you hear a lot of stories again, but he does a better job of kind of starting anew. You don't hear a lot of the same things over and over again. You still get a lot of stuff that you've read in the previous two, but it's a little bit more toned down for me. Like I said, I think these are all good books, and, having them set up this way, it does let you kind of pick which one, like which section of history of Commodore that you want to hear about. I still don't think that they should have been, I don't think it should have been 3, I think it could have just been 2, though. That being said, Brian did a great job with these. He put a lot of information in here. He talked to a lot of people. He got a lot of the sides of the story. There's a lot of perspectives in here. It's a really great comprehensive history of Commodore, at least from what I can tell. I learned an awful lot about this, about the Commodore and about Commodore computers and everything. And it also helped me kind of look out for, Bill Hurd's book when that came out. If you want to read that book, it's Back Into the Storm. It is a great book. It is really, really good. I would actually recommend reading that instead of the Amiga Years. Definitely read On the Edge. It's a really great story. And then read the final years so you can kind of see how everything fell apart. And if you want to, then pick up the Amiga Years to read it, but I don't think it's really needed. None of these books you don't really need to buy all 3 of them. You can pick which one that you want to read. But definitely read Bill Hurd's book, which is separate from these, and it's a really great one as well. Going into these books, I didn't really know a lot about Commodore. I had no idea that the company existed until really the internet came around, and I started doing, just basically falling into rabbit holes in the early 2010s. So getting these and reading all about the history of this computer company that I didn't know anything about, and I never owned any of their computers and still don't, it's really interesting to read them, especially just how video games were made back in the 80s, how software was made, and then hearing about how the hardware for these things were made is just absolutely fascinating. Even if I didn't understand everything that was being said, it's still a really great read. So that's going to wrap things up, guys. I will quit rambling because I know that I have gone on for a ridiculous amount of time, and this video is already way longer than what I wanted it to be. So I'll wrap everything up. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like what you saw, please consider subscribing. And all the other stuff that other YouTubers tell you to do. If you made it this far, definitely just give me your favorite Commodore game. Just put your favorite Commodore game in the comments below, and let's stick with that. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day. Bye.